For 50 years, the government denied he ever existed. No pension, no medals, no service record. To his neighbors in this remote mountain town, Arthur was just the crazy hermit at the end of the dirt road, a ghost waiting to die. But as a historian of the forgotten, I knew they were lying. I tracked him down not to expose a crime, but to solve a 50-year-old riddle. I thought I was prepared for his story. But when he finally unlocked his door and showed me what he kept in that rusted metal box, I realized that sometimes the only way to remain human is to become a ghost. But to understand this, I need to go back. Before I take you up that mountain and show you what was hidden inside the cabin, I want to know who is walking this path with me today. Where are you watching from? Let me know your city or country in the comments below. The drive to Blackwood Ridge was not for the faint of heart. It was a 4-hour ascent into the grey, misty spine of the northern Appalachians, a place where the GPS signal died long before the paved roads did. The trees here didn't look like the vibrant green forests of the postcards. They were twisted, ancient things, stripped bare by a wind that never seemed to stop howling. It was the kind of landscape that kept secrets well. I had spent 6 months digging through declassified archives in the basement of the Library of Congress before I even found a whisper of his location. Arthur Vance. A name that, according to the official United States Army records, belonged to a clerk who died of pneumonia in a training camp in 1969. But I had a photo from 1971, a grainy, black-and-white surveillance shot taken in a jungle halfway across the world, showing a man with Arthur's eyes standing over a burning village. He wasn't a clerk, and he didn't die in 1969. When I finally pulled my rental car into the gravel lot of the only diner in town, the Rust and Bone, the locals stopped eating. It was that kind of town. I sat at the counter, the smell of stale coffee and damp wool heavy in the air. When I asked the waitress, a woman with tired eyes and hands roughened by hard work, about the old man living up on the ridge, she nearly dropped the coffee pot. "You mean old man Artie?" she whispered, leaning in as if the name itself was a curse. "Honey, you turn that car around. He isn't just a hermit, he's broken. My husband went up there 10 years ago to check on him during a blizzard. Artie met him at the property line with a rifle, said the next person to cross the line wouldn't walk back down." She wiped the counter nervously. "People say he did things in the war, bad things, things that made God turn his back on him. That's why he lives up there where the clouds touch the ground. He's hiding from judgment." I didn't tell her that judgment was exactly what I was looking for. I drank my coffee black, left a generous tip, and drove the final 5 miles until the gravel turned to mud. The cabin wasn't just a house, it was a fortification. It sat perched on a cliff edge, overlooking a valley swallowed by fog. The windows were boarded up from the inside, leaving only slivers of glass visible. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, despite the freezing temperature. It looked like a tomb. It looked like a place where time had stopped 50 years ago. I parked the car at the bottom of the steep driveway and walked up. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dead leaves. I felt a heaviness in my chest, that distinct instinct that tells you are being watched. I wasn't just walking into a man's home. I was walking into a memory he had spent a lifetime trying to execute. I reached the front porch. The wood was rotting, but the door was reinforced steel, completely out of place for a wooden cabin. It was painted a dull military green. I raised my hand to knock, my knuckles brushing against the cold metal. That's when something felt wrong. It wasn't the silence that bothered me. It was the sound that followed my knock. Usually when you knock on the door of an elderly recluse, you hear the slow shuffle of feet, maybe the creak of a floorboard or the bark of a dog. But when I knocked on Arthur Vance's door, I heard the distinct mechanical click-clack of a weapon being racked. It was sharp, professional, and immediate. "I'm not buying what you're selling," a voice rasped from the other side. It sounded like gravel grinding against steel. "Leave." "Mr. Vance," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is David Miller. I'm a historian. I'm not selling anything. I want to talk to you about Operation Silent Rain." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Silent Rain. The code name that wasn't supposed to exist. The code name I had found on a charred fragment of a document that should have been shredded decades ago. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then, the sound of 3 heavy deadbolts sliding back echoed through the wood. The door creaked open, but only a few inches. A security chain kept it taut. Through the crack, I saw a single eye. It was pale blue, surrounded by a road map of deep wrinkles, but the gaze was sharp, lucid, and terrifyingly alert. This wasn't the gaze of a senile old man. It was the gaze of a soldier who was still on patrol. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The smell wafting from the house was a mix of old paper, gun oil, and something medicinal, like antiseptic. "No one," I said, holding up my hands to show they were empty. "I found the discrepancy in the 1971 logbooks, the missing platoon. I know you were there, Arthur. I know you didn't die in training." He stared at me, assessing my threat level. Slowly, his eyes drifted down to my bag, then back to my face. He unhooked the chain. "Get in," he growled. "Quickly, before they see you." I didn't ask who they were. I just stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a shock. The outside was ruin and decay, but the inside was organized with obsessive military precision. There was no dust. The floorboards were swept clean, but what caught my breath was the walls. They were covered, not with wallpaper, but with maps. Topographical maps, hand-drawn sketches of jungle terrain and timelines scrawled on butcher paper. Red strings connected dates and locations. It looked like the war room of a commander who was still fighting a battle that ended half a century ago. This channel exists to tell the stories that history tries to erase. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, you are in the right place. I walked further into the room. On a small wooden table in the center, there was no television, no magazines, just a disassembled radio, an ancient field transmitter from the Vietnam era, and a stack of unopened letters. "You live like you're expecting an attack," I said softly, looking at the boarded windows. Arthur was locking the door behind us, engaging every bolt. He turned, limping slightly on his left leg. He was a small man, shrunken by age, but his forearms were still wiry and strong. He wore a faded flannel shirt tucked into trousers that were perfectly creased. "I'm not expecting an attack, son," he said, walking past me to the table. He picked up a cloth and began wiping the already clean radio parts. "I'm expecting a correction." "A correction?" "The universe doesn't like loose ends," he muttered, "and that's what I am. A loose end." He gestured for me to sit on a wooden stool. He didn't offer me water. He didn't offer me tea. He just stood there, polishing the metal, waiting. I looked around the room again. My eyes landed on a shelf in the corner. It was empty, except for one thing, a small, colorful child's toy. A wooden bird, painted with bright blues and yellows, the paint chipped and fading. It looked innocent, joyful even, but it was sitting on a black velvet cloth, treated like a holy relic. I took a step toward it. "Don't touch that." Arthur's voice whipped across the room like a lash. I froze. "It's a toy." "It's evidence," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. And then I found something I wasn't supposed to see. I stepped back from the shelf, raising my hands again. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." Arthur didn't relax. He moved between me and the shelf, his body acting as a shield. "You didn't come here for toys, Mr. Historian. You came for the story. You want to know how a dead man is walking around the Appalachians." "I want the truth," I said, sitting down on the stool. "The official record says your platoon was wiped out by enemy mortar fire, but the casualty reports don't match the timeline. I found a transport manifest. You came back, you and 6 others, but only you are alive today." Arthur's face tightened. A muscle in his jaw jumped. "Alive?" he scoffed. "Is that what you call this?" He swept his hand around the dark, claustrophobic room. "I've been breathing for 50 years, sure. But I haven't been alive since the day we boarded that chopper." "Why hide, Arthur?" I pressed. "If you survived, why erase yourself? Why deny your family, your name? There are people who mourn you. Your sister's daughter. She tried to find you for years." "Stop," he commanded. The pain in his eyes was sudden and raw. "Don't you bring them into this room. That world, the world of families and Sunday dinners and grocery stores. That's for the living. I forfeited my ticket to that world to keep them safe." "Safe from what?" I asked, frustration rising in my voice. "The war is over. The government isn't hunting you anymore. It's been decades." Arthur laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. He walked over to the wall covered in maps and tapped a specific location circled in red ink. "The war ended for you," he said. "The war ended for the politicians. But for us, for the men of Silent Rain, the war just changed locations." He pulled a knife from his belt, a combat knife, worn but razor-sharp, and stabbed it into the map. "We weren't sent there to fight soldiers, boy. We were sent to recover something. A crate. Command told us it was intel, codes, crucial for national security." He turned to me, his eyes wide with a frantic intensity. "Do you know what happens when you open a box you're told to guard with your life, and you find out it's not codes inside?" I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What was inside the crate, Arthur?" He hesitated. For the first time, I saw fear. Not fear of me, but fear of the memory. He looked at the boarded windows as if expecting them to shatter inward at any moment. "We were in the middle of the valley," he whispered. "The rain was so loud you couldn't think. We had the crate. The chopper was inbound, but then the crying started." "Crying?" "Not us." He shook his head violently. "From the crate. The crate was crying." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold cabin. "Arthur, what are you saying?" He walked back to the table and sat down heavily, putting his head in his hands. "I'm saying that when we pried that lid open, we didn't find documents. We didn't find gold." And he looked up at me, his eyes swimming with tears that he refused to shed. "We found the reason why I can never go back to the world." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. He was teetering on the edge of the confession he had held back for half a century. I knew I had to push him, but I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, he would shut down forever. "You opened it," I said softly. "And you disobeyed orders." "Disobeyed," Arthur whispered. "I started a mutiny." That's when the truth started to surface. "A mutiny," I repeated, the word hanging heavy in the stagnant air of the cabin. "You turned on your own unit." Arthur shook his head slowly. He stood up and walked to the wall covered in maps. He traced a line through the dense green of the jungle depiction. His finger trembled just slightly. "Not the unit," he corrected, his voice distant, as if he were back there in the mud and the rain. "We turned on the mission." He turned to face me, and for a moment the hardened shell of the hermit cracked. I saw the 20-year-old soldier underneath. "You have to understand the noise, David. The rain in that valley. It was like static, constant. We were exhausted. 3 days humping that crate through the bush. It was heavy, awkward. We joked it was full of gold bars or maybe high-grade whiskey for the general." Arthur paused, licking his dry lips. Then the crate moved. "Hey." He walked over to the wooden bird on the shelf. He didn't touch it, just hovered his hand near it. "We set it down in a clearing. Corporal Miller, no relation to you, he had a crowbar. We knew it was against protocol. Do not open under penalty of court-martial." That was stenciled on the side in black paint. But the sound coming from inside, it wasn't mechanical. It was human. I held my breath. The wind outside the cabin howled, rattling the boarded windows, providing a ghostly soundtrack to his confession. Miller popped the lid, Arthur whispered. It wasn't gold. It wasn't codes. He looked me dead in the eye. It was 2 children. My pen stopped moving on my notepad. Children? A boy and a girl, Arthur continued, his voice gaining strength. Maybe 5 and 7 years old. They were sedated, sleeping on a bed of straw and medical packs, but the sedation was wearing off. The girl, she was the one crying in her sleep. Why? I asked, horrified. Why would the army transport children in a sealed crate? We didn't know, Arthur said, but the radio sparked to life right then. Command. They asked for our status. They asked if the package was secure, and then they gave the order. Arthur closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The order was, asset compromised. Dispose of package immediately. Return to extraction point. To dispose? I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. They meant kill them, Arthur said flatly. They weren't refugees. They were assets, witnesses, or maybe the children of someone important the government wanted to erase. We never found out who they were. We just knew what we were ordered to do. He moved back to the table and sat down, his hands clasped tight. There were 6 of us, 6 tired, hungry men who just wanted to go home. The lieutenant, he reached for his sidearm. He was a good soldier. He followed orders. He looked at the crate, then he looked at us and said, "It's war. We don't ask questions." "And what did you do?" I asked. "I leveled my M16 at his chest," Arthur said. The memory was clear as day to him. I told him, "No." Then Miller aimed his weapon at the lieutenant too, then Stevens. One by one, the squad chose the children over the uniform. "You killed your lieutenant?" "No," Arthur said softly. He looked at us. He looked at the girl, who had just opened her eyes. She had eyes like that sky out there, grey, terrified. And the lieutenant, he broke. He dropped his gun. He said, "If we don't do this, they'll kill us all. They'll hunt us down." Arthur leaned forward, his face illuminated by the single dim bulb in the room. "So we made a choice. We didn't kill the lieutenant. We killed ourselves. The report," I realized aloud. "Mortar fire. No survivors. We staged it." Arthur nodded. "We used all our explosives. We took our dog tags off and threw them into the crater. We burned the truck. We vanished into the jungle with the children. We became ghosts so they could live." But the worst part came later. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of secrecy, it was the silence of tragedy. I looked at the old man and realized the magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't just deserted, he had erased his entire life. "We thought that was the hard part," Arthur whispered. "Disappearing, living off the grid in foreign countries, smuggling the kids across borders. But we were wrong." He stood up and walked to a locked drawer in his desk. He pulled out a key from around his neck, his hands trembling violently now. He unlocked the drawer and pulled out a photograph. It was old, yellowed, the edges frayed. He slid it across the table to me. It showed Arthur, much younger, sitting on a porch step. Sitting on his knee was a little girl with bright eyes, holding the wooden bird I had seen on the shelf. She looked happy. She looked safe. "We couldn't keep them together," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "It was too dangerous." The squad split up. Miller took the boy. I took the girl. Her name was... I called her Sarah. He looked at the photo with a longing so deep it filled the room. "I raised her for 6 years, David. We lived in small towns, moving every few months. I was her father. She was my world. I taught her to read. I taught her to carve wood. I watched her lose her first tooth. Where is she now?" I asked gently. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He looked away, towards the darkness of the corner. "The government never stopped looking," he said. "Not for us. For them. They started finding the others. Miller. They found him in 78. A car accident. The boy. Gone. They killed the boy." "I don't know," Arthur said. "But silence is usually an answer. Some stories stay silent for years because the cost of telling them is too high. If you've ever had to give up something you loved to protect it, you're not alone." Share your strength in the comments. Arthur looked back at me, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. I knew they were getting close. I saw a car parked down the street 2 days in a row. I knew I couldn't protect her anymore, not if I stayed with her. I was the target. I was the beacon drawing them in. He pointed a shaking finger at the photo. The worst day of my life wasn't the war. It wasn't the ambush. It was the day I drove Sarah to a church in Ohio. I told her to wait on the steps. I told her I was going to get ice cream. His voice broke into a sob. I drove away. I watched her in the rearview mirror. She was holding that wooden bird. She was waiting for her daddy. And I just kept driving. He slammed his fist onto the table, a sudden release of 50 years of guilt. I had to abandon her to save her. If I stayed, they would have killed us both. If I left, she became just another orphan, a ward of the state. Invisible. Safe. I have lived every single day of the last 40 years wondering if she hates me, Arthur wept. Wondering if she thinks I didn't love her. I died to the world in 1971, David. But my soul died on those church steps in 1979. He slumped back in his chair, exhausted, a man hollowed out by sacrifice. That is why I am here. That is why I have a rifle at the door. I'm not hiding from the law. I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the day I can tell her why. I looked at the photo, then at the wooden bird on the shelf. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking together in my mind, forming a picture that was both tragic and hopeful. Arthur, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You said you raised her until 1979? Yes. And she had that wooden bird? Yes, I carved it for her. I reached into my own jacket pocket. My hand was shaking now. Then came the moment I will never forget. The wind outside had died down, leaving the cabin in a heavy, expectant silence. Arthur was staring at my hand, his breath catching in his throat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a soft white handkerchief. I placed it on the table between us, right next to the pristine, colorful bird Arthur kept on his shelf. I unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside lay another wooden bird. But this one wasn't bright and colorful. It was worn smooth by decades of handling. The paint was faded to near invisibility. One of the wings had been glued back on clumsily, likely by a child's hand. Arthur stopped breathing. He reached out, his trembling fingers hovering over the worn wood, but he was too afraid to touch it. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and impossible hope. Where? His voice was a broken whisper. Where did you get this? My mother kept it on her nightstand, I said, my voice thick with emotion. She told me it was the only thing she had left of her father. She said he gave it to her to keep her brave. Arthur grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Your mother? I'm not just a historian, Arthur, I said, finally dropping the professional mask. My name is David, but my middle name isn't Miller. It's Arthur. My mother is Sarah. The old man let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently. She's alive, he muffled through his hands. She's safe. She's safe, I assured him. She was adopted by a good family 3 days after you left her, but she never forgot. She never changed her name. She told me stories about the man who taught her to carve wood, the man who saved her life twice, once from the jungle and once from the people who wanted to hurt her. I pushed the worn wooden bird closer to him. She didn't hate you, Grandpa. She never hated you. She understood. Maybe not when she was 7, but when she had me. She understood what it cost to protect someone you love. Arthur lifted his head. The hard, military glare was gone. In its place was just an old man who had carried the weight of the world for too long. He reached out and picked up the worn bird, cradling it against his chest like it was the most precious diamond on earth. I thought I killed her heart, he wept. I thought she would curse my name. She didn't send me here to curse you, I said softly. She sent me here to bring you home. Arthur looked at me, confusion clouding his tear-filled eyes. Home? I can't. The danger? The government? Duke. The files were declassified 6 months ago, Arthur, I revealed. The men who ordered the mission are dead. The secret isn't a weapon anymore. It's just history. You're not a fugitive. You're a hero who disappeared. I stood up and offered him my hand. Pack your things. You don't have to be a ghost anymore. But this story didn't end there. It took Arthur an hour to pack. He didn't take much. The map stayed on the walls. The radio stayed on the table. He took the metal box, the photos, and the 2 wooden birds. The walk down the mountain was slow. He leaned on me, his limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline had faded, but his head was held high. For the first time in 50 years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. When we reached the bottom of the gravel road where my car was parked, the passenger door opened. A woman with silver hair and eyes that matched the grey sky stepped out. She was holding a cane, but she stood tall. Arthur froze. He looked at me, panic rising again. "It's okay," I whispered. "She wanted to come. She's been waiting in the car." Sarah walked forward. She didn't run. She couldn't. She walked with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who had waited a lifetime for this moment. She stopped 3 feet from him. Arthur looked at the woman who used to be the little girl on the church steps. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But Sarah closed the gap. She didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around his frail shoulders and buried her face in his neck, exactly as she had done in the jungle 50 years ago. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. I watched them hold each other. As the sun began to break through the grey clouds over the Appalachians, I saw the 50 years of pain, silence, and sacrifice melt away in a single embrace. Arthur Vance died 3 years later peacefully in his daughter's guest room, surrounded by grandchildren who knew his name. He wasn't buried as a ghost. He was buried with full military honors, but the only medal he wanted in his casket was a small chipped wooden bird. Stories like this exist because someone was brave enough to make the hardest choice of all, to be forgotten so that someone else could have a future. Love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes the deepest love is found in the courage to let go and the faith that one day the truth will find its way home. If you believe that no hero should be forgotten and that stories like Arthur's deserve to be remembered, you are always welcome here. Subscribe to the Triumph Stories and let's keep history alive together. See you in the next video.